Coming up on this episode of the All Aboard Podcast, we make our second attempt to talk about this week in railroads for June 10th through 14th, 2024. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, or should I say, Extra number 1. It is your thrice weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who audience, and I'm holding the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And for the second time today, it is great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. So I am going to go ahead and give this another whirl. Let's see if we can possibly get it right. I got to apologize to you. The first time we had some people in the back who were apparently trying to do yard work at 7 p.m. on a Friday, something I've never, ever seen before. And adding to that, it looks like our streaming was not working properly, but now it looks like it is. So let's get back to it. What happened this week in railroading? So the first thing, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority issued a request for proposals for a train protection system for its Green Line streetcar network. Now, as you know, if you've been following us here, the Green Line is the oldest subway in America. Excuse me. Today, it is a combination of both subway and surface, as well as elevated trackage. Now, on its northern end, it operates from Medford and Somerville, that area in Massachusetts. Then it runs on a viaduct near the Science Museum, and then past the TD Bank North Garden, where it goes underground, and then it runs in a subway under downtown Boston and through the prestigious Back Bay area out to Boston's southern and western suburbs. And it has 4 branches. Now, the first that you'll come to is the E line that leaves at Copley Station. And this is what goes through Northeastern University and goes as far as Heath Street. It once did go all the way to a location called Arbor Way, where it next to the Orange Line and the New Haven, former New York, New Haven, and Hartford, now what Amtrak calls the Southwest Corridor portion of its Northeast Corridor, routing Southwest Corridor through Boston. That's why it's named that, and falls in the same area as Interstate 93. Now it terminates at Heath Street and has a small segment of street running. So one of the few actual street running segments on the entire streetcar network that remains in Boston. The second is the former New York Central Highland branch, and this is now the MBTA's Green Line D branch, and that is a beautiful trip if you ever get a chance to ride, because sometimes you will get up to about 50 miles an hour. Not only that, but the scenery is great, and it runs all the way out to Newton and terminates in Riverside, which is also the location of a major car house installation for the MBTA and the Green Line. Next is the C, which follows Beacon Street, actually operates in the middle of Beacon Street on a reservation, so its own reserved area, so not in the street itself, until the very end, where it goes down to Cleveland Circle, and that portion actually is in the street. And then you have the B branch, which is well known to me because I lived along it when I attended Boston University, where I graduated from, and that serves not only BU, but our rival school, Boston College, which is at the end of the line in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts, right near Newton and just outside the Boston city limits. Now, why does this matter? Well, on the Green Line, they currently have a block signaling system. Now, on the surface routes, with the exception of the D line, which is mostly which actually I don't believe has any grade crossings. And if I'm wrong about that, please fact check me, because it has been a few years since I've been there riding the trains there. But where you do have grade crossings, the signals are tied in with the traffic signal. So therefore, if you've got a street that is crossing the green line tracks, well, whenever those streets have the green light, the streetcar has to stop, as does the traffic that is crossing it. And then, or as the traffic that's parallel, excuse me. And then when the light turns green, they're able to go, and it's the same pattern of red, yellow, green that we have on regular automotive traffic signals. Now, once you get in the subway, though, you still have a similar pattern, but in that case, those are traditional block signals, and they are activated and deactivated by the presence of a streetcar or lack thereof in that block. What is very interesting is that Copley Square, where you have a good straightaway and you can see several blocks in front of you. And that's what really does make for an interesting trip, because this is where the streetcar operators are pretty much able to, although they're required to follow the speed rules that the MBTA lays out in its employee timetable, it does often depend on the operator and, how heavy a foot they have, because the Type 7s, which are the 36 and 3700 series streetcars there, they do have foot controls, which are very similar to the PCCs and also similar to what you would see in your run-of-the-mill city bus. Now, unlike a city bus, of course, it is not activating, governor on a diesel engine, but those are a Cineston controller, which is the same thing that you might see in any other streetcar, except that having a gas and brake, or accelerator and brake, basically tied into the same thing, the same unit, control unit, as opposed to them doing separate things and activating separate systems. It's all similar to what you would find on the MBTA's 015, 16, 17, and 1800 series cars, just in slightly different forms. The 1800 series, built by with electricals by GE and bodies by Bombardier on the red line, those have hand controls that are that do not wind or do not appear to wind, whereas on the 1500 and 1600s, it is a little bit more reminiscent of a winding controller, although it does not actually do that. So that gives you an idea of what you're dealing with when you're talking about the controls on an MBTA streetcar and why this RFP is so interesting. Now, pulling a quote here, the system will, number 1, prevent trains from passing red signals or other stop signals. Number 2, enforce speed limits on green line vehicles. Number 3, prevent train-to-train collisions on tracks used for passenger service. And number 4, preventing incursions into roadway work zones. Now, you might remember in the early 2010s, there was a fairly serious accident on the green line where one operator was using the cell phone and ended up plowing into the back of a stopped streetcar, which I believe was near Government Center, the Scollay Square station of the Kingston Trio's famous song, MTA, where Charlie is, when his train comes rumbling through, his wife throws him a sandwich. She doesn't give him the exit fare because she probably doesn't want him to come back home, but she throws him a sandwich. That's Scollay Square, now the Government Center station. That is, I believe, where this accident took place. One of the things that helped lead to this. But that also does go to the speed limits on green line vehicles. As I said earlier, a lot of the speed limits, although they are prescribed by the organization in their timetable, it does a lot of times depend on the operator and how comfortable they are operating at whatever speed. So this would certainly add a lot more in the way of certainty and making the operation a little bit more tighter from that standpoint. Again, the train-to-train collisions, as we mentioned before. But the last part is also noteworthy because preventing incursions into roadway work zones. That's notable because on the green line, due to the fact that so much of the surface portion of the system is relatively close to roadways, this gives them the ability to also include road work that may not be taking place on the railroad itself into such computer prescribed restrictions, and that might provide an additional measure for safety for someone who might be, let's say, operating an excavator on the street, let's say Commonwealth Avenue, right next to the B branch, but there might be a little bit of a swing or accidental movement that could put it in the path of a train. Well, this would be able to not only deal with the work that is taking place on the track itself, but next door, so that streetcars may be slowing down in those places and either prevent or lessen the sort of damage and injuries that could take place there. The next that we have here is from CSX. And CSX released new plans for several of its rail yards, most notably its Cumberland terminal, which is in Cumberland, Maryland. Now, Cumberland has been a very important point on the CSX network, but also on the predecessor Chessie system in Baltimore and Ohio for decades. Cumberland was also an important point on the Western Maryland, which was taken over legally by the Chesapeake and Ohio, but effectively integrated into the Baltimore and Ohio system in the late 1970s. And so if you go out to Cumberland, obviously you'll see in the downtown area a very large rail yard and also a small Amtrak station. Actually, that yard does take up almost the entirety of the downtown that isn't, residential and business. It's very big. And nearby the Western Maryland, the portion of the Western Maryland that remains there is mostly used by the Western Maryland Scenic, which is the home to number 1309, which is the 2662 Malley that it was recently restored to operate to pull their trains on that scenic route out to Frostburg, Maryland. But when you go to Cumberland in years past, you would see cars being shoved over the hump and into the classification yard. And the hump yard was a revolutionary thing for railroads for decades. And this was one of the ways that they would save on labor, because flat switching in years past required a lot of people. It required steam locomotives in general, and it was a very slow process. Well, as time's gone on, there was one thing that was important. Although hump yards made it easy to get the cars off of one train and classify them into areas with a little bit less in the way of motive power and also labor, they also have a lot of infrastructure that goes into them. Now, you've got to think about the switches, the retarders. The retarders control the speed of the cars as they flow down from the hump itself into the bowl. You have a lot of maintenance that's going to take place on the switches on their own anyway. And so therefore, as time went on, a lot of the advocates of precision scheduled railroading, which included, of course, E. Hunter Harrison, who was leading CSX when the Cumberland hump was shut down in 2017, started to believe that it might end up being easier to flat switch a lot of this. And by flat switching, we mean going back to the process of using locomotives on either end of the yard to take cars off of an incoming train and then put them where they're supposed to be on the individual yard tracks to be made up into outgoing trains, whether those are locals or those are road trains. So this is something that we've seen all across not only CSX, but across the industry. In places like Linwood on Norfolk Southern, we've seen changes taking place. I believe it was Neff Yard in Kansas City, which by and large was shut down. The hump over at Tilford Yard in Atlanta was actually bulldozed completely. And so that is actually what's going to take place at Cumberland. So while the humping will not be coming back, bulldozing the hump is going to allow them to extend some of the tracks there and make it easier to do flat switching at a faster speed. And this is believed to be a better fit for the more hybrid precision scheduled railroading model that you're going to now see continue to roll out across the Class 1 carriers. Because remember, on one hand, you do have a very strong investor desire, as we saw with the Ancora Norfolk Southern proxy fight, to continue having a low operating ratio and more cash available for dividends. At the same time, you do have a recognition that there must be an effort made on the part of the railroad to maintain service fluidity, and it is believed that there is not as much service fluidity as might be hoped for in the precision scheduled railroading environment. I don't know how true that is, because I can tell you before PSR, during PSR, after PSR, there are always going to be situations where any railroad, no matter how well run or how much we love it, is going to have some difficulty with fluidity, and that will have resulted from a variety of reasons, whether we're talking about the weather itself, whether we are talking about the availability of crews, whether we're talking about the availability of motive power, and then also the ability of connecting trains to get into a certain area before we even start talking about interchange to other railroads. Best story I heard about this actually comes from Conway Yard in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where there's a story told in a 1977 Trains magazine where there were a lot of trains that Conrail had that were waiting to get out of Conway Yard, but they couldn't move. That's because the locomotives that were supposed to pull them were waiting to get into the yard on the inbound trains, and that yard was so stuffed full of trains waiting to go out, the locomotives couldn't leave their trains to get to a servicing facility to be fueled, serviced, and inspected, and then get put on the outbound train. So that gives you an idea of how difficult this can be and why it's interesting that CSX is taking the time and the money to make these investments with the hope of maintaining fluidity while also keeping with the low operating ratio goals that are endemic to PSR. Now, in addition to Cumberland, you're going to see this happening at Willard, which is one of the most important facilities on CSX because that is blocking traffic that's going to go through the Chicago Gateway as well as the St. Louis Gateway. Once on the B&O, the Chicago Gateway through the B&O and the St. Louis Gateway and the former Conrail and Big Four route there. And Hamlet is also notable because this is where traffic gets blocked for Atlanta, Birmingham, and New Orleans and Texas, as well as a limited amount that continues to go southeast from Hamlet down to South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, and then into Florida. The majority of the Florida traffic, of course, going over the Atlantic coastline, A-line route, which is to the east and not touching Hamlet. So seeing that may indicate some interest in a little bit greater investment in some of those properties of the former Seaboard airline in the southeastern United States on CSX's system. Now, the next thing to discuss is CARB, the California Air Resources Board, and Chuck Baker, who is a friend of mine and the head of the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association. So this week, he gave his testimony on why CARB should not, or excuse me, why the EPA should not approve the request by the California Air Resources Board to allow California to make its own rules for locomotive emissions. Now, here's why this is interesting, should be interesting to you. California, for many years, has used CARB, which is by and large what I would call an unaccountable agency to the public, to determine environmental standards for just about everything. And that can be your home, your car, your locomotives, or otherwise. Now, in general, rail regulation is mostly handled at the federal level. And that's because, as you can expect, if a railroad is heavily regulated by states in addition to the federal government, and the states are not required to harmonize their regulations with those of the neighboring states, then you'll have a situation where the railroad network quickly becomes balkanized. And so that's why, even though there will be some rules that are imposed by states, for example, some states would have full crew laws where you had to have at least 5 people on any given train. Other states like Virginia for a long time had rules related to cabooses where the RF&P, the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac being an intrastate carrier, had to continue having cabooses because it was entirely located within Virginia, even though it was not entirely operated within Virginia, which is something that people tend to forget. Where Virginia was still requiring them in the 1980s to have cabooses, whereas the Seaboard Coastline and Seaboard System, or its successor Seaboard System, was not required to do so. And the same goes with the Southern, the N&W, and so on, that came down here, Conrail too. So there are some, but by and large, the regulations handled at the federal level. So California, in order to impose its rule, which would end the ability to operate any locomotive older than 23 years old, and then set even more stringent standards than Tier 4 for any and all diesel electric locomotives, would require the approval of the EPA. Now, this is a question because on one hand, the Biden administration has been very friendly in terms of wanting to expand the use of rail, both freight and passenger, and that is something that Joe Biden has said, even when he was in the U.S. Senate and being a big patron of Amtrak himself. On the other hand, there is a very strong environmental lobby that wants to regulate anything and everything in any restrictive way that is possible, and California is most certainly part of that. Now, in my former role over at FreedomWorks, I did submit I wrote the comment for the organization, or most of the comment, where we pointed out that in the event that this was allowed to go through, if it were, applied nationally, then almost all the locomotives that are used in North Carolina DOT's passenger network, so those are the Piedmont trains, as well as the trains you've probably been hearing about operating down at the U.S. Open in North Carolina by Pinehurst, would be disallowed from operating. Because this idea that not only do the rules have to be so stringent that there's almost no technology in order to permit those locomotives to operate, but also because of the 23-year-old rule, that would force not only your shortline carriers and regional are always having a difficult time raising the capital to purchase a locomotive, whether we're talking about the debt or the equity, but this would impose similar computer agencies, which even though California has done a substantial amount, when I say California, I mean the agencies such as Coaster and Caltrain, which is soon to be retiring its F40PHs in favor of electric locomotives. Let's also remember, or electric MUs, let's also remember that 23 years old actually isn't that old. Some of the GEVOs, the ES44DC, the ES44AC, a lot of those locomotives are getting close to the 23-year-old mark because they started to be introduced in 2005. So that tells you how very little time such a long-lived asset, especially those which the railroads purchased with the goal of complying with stringent environmental standards, would soon be unusable in large markets. So we fought that over Freedom Works, and Chuck Baker has been very, very hardworking and making sure to bring a lot of that information out with the hope of convincing the Biden administration's EPA to not approve, or at least to just stay California's application and allow discussions to continue, because this certainly is an untenable situation and would actually make California be simply an outlier where it'd be next to impossible to have rail transportation of any form except in very small pockets. And I'll also point out that would impact locomotive and use it as not one of these charged. So that's something to think about as well. Next, the big boy, everybody's favorite steam locomotive, the big boy, Union Pacific number 4014. It was recently updated with self-contained positive train control. Now, is it a big boy at all? The tours, you know that they did, every tour has taken place with a diesel electric locomotive in the consist. Now, we're going to do something that we know tends to get us in trouble over here at the Old Board Podcast. We are going to try and see and hope that maybe, just maybe, that we can get you a little picture of what I'm speaking of. Now, for some time, what you would see are a couple of locomotives, including a CET and also an SD70 Ace SD70M that were used as a companion with the big boy during its first few tours. That is a photo I took for those of you on CP5 cam of the SD70 ACET4, which was at number 25, which was at West Chicago, Illinois, and then this one that's in North Platte, Nebraska. And that is the SD70M, number 4015. So selected because, of course, it was just one number above the 4014. And so that made them both somewhat celebrities during the tours they went on with Union Pacific. Now, the way it worked is there was a PTC screen that was located in the big boy cab right next to the engineer's seat, and not only the engineer, but the fireman, and there's usually several guys in the cabin, not just two, were able to view it and check the readout and help. The engineer was usually Ed Dickens to do what it is that he needs to do as far as utilizing the PTC and making sure that there are no unscheduled stops, that they're following all the rules so that it doesn't have to kick in. Well, that would actually run back to one of these electric locomotives that was located behind it, and it was equipment special PTC system that could read the fact that the front of the locomotive was actually ahead of where the receivers were. And that's notable because this is a problem, not only with PTC, but it was a problem years ago with ATS, automatic train stop, and ATS, automatic people, because then the situation was slightly different, because back then it was a problem for engineers to now be sitting so close to cup shoes located, as well as locomotive, where they was a lot further back if you had those cup shoes located on a lead truck, so because they're so much further ahead. So when